Learning Disability Association defined learning disabilities are due to genetic and or neurobiological factors that alter brain functioning in a manner which affects one or more cognitive processes related to learning. And it is mostly reading and writing and math, or math. So these genetic and or neurobiological factors, that definition, if your teachers and your general education teachers or special education teachers, regardless of what areas, you read this definition, you automatically have a perception and perspectives that you cannot teach these children because they already have a genetic neurobiological caused disabilities, right? So it really gives them really just really not really, I don't know, just really that positive perspectives. And I don't believe any teachers are strongly encouraged to work on this. So I'm not sure, this is, yes, this is a right definition. However, this is a really scary definition. I see it. And I don't believe, it could be some, parents could be relieved and teachers are just relieved because it's not their weak teaching result. It's not their teaching outcome. So it is child nature has already these difficulties. So no matter what you do, it will be permanent. So that is really sad to hear. And Glenn Doman and Engelman in direct instruction, they said cognitive and intelligence are not permanent, not factual symptoms. They said cognition and intelligence are fluid. So fluid means you can shape, you can remediate. So genetic and neurobiological factors impact the cognitive processing, right? Yes, learning is all controlled by, actually that's founded based on cognition and cognitive processing and cognitive functions. So it is very important. However, this cognition, anybody hear about the cognition, cognitive deficits, they believe this is just done deal. You cannot work on it. However, if you analyze what cognition is, what cognitive function is, and then that cognitive function is basically, it's a sensory input. So you visually see, and then you process, you hear, you process, you touch, you process and know what that is, right? So you see, you process, you know what that is. You hear, you process, you know what that is. That's just sensory processing, and we call the end of sensory processing outcomes are sensory discrimination. So you see, you know. You hear, you know. You touch, you know. That's a sensory discrimination. That is the beginning stage of cognitive processing. So when child is born, beginning, their eyes are not quite, acute yet. However, they could hear. And then when parents hold them, they can feel, right? That is the beginning stage. And then their motor skill is gradually developed, and then they move around, and then they receive more sensory inputs, and they process and they develop. So this cognition, and then they know social, emotion, language, motor, sense. These five are set cognitive domains. So when we say developmental domain and cognitive domain, these five are cognitive domains. These looks like a very independent domains, but they are all interlinked, interrelated, intertwined. So when they develop those, developmental period, they just develop together, helping each other, affecting each other, impacting each other. So they well balanced development. That's what typical children's cognitive development. And when these, interlinked developmental ties are, disconnected or a little bit loose, and then that's how developmental delays started. These developmental delays could be just one area, two areas, or just entire all areas. However, while doing this cognition is kind of, headquarter jobs they do. They are executing this cognitive whole, domains development. This cognition is very important. And then human learning is a very tight cognition. So we say just, language and cognition is very just like a tied. And then we say social cognition is a social sense, right? And then we have a emotional cognition, and then, emotional intelligence, like EQ, and then people say, however, this is emotional cognition. And then people skills and social sense and emotion, it's all involved there. And then physical growing, this physical development, the physical impairment are a little bit different from this sensory-based motor function. So sensory-based motor disorder means your motor functions are not function, but physically you don't have any impairment. However, your motor senses are a little bit dull, not sensitive, not accurate. So we call most of disabilities, students, whatever disability, they have a disability labels. Most of disabilities has motor clumsiness there. So it's not they have any orthopedic impairment. However, they could have a sensory-based motor function, dysfunction and disorder. So that sensory-based is motor senses. So you just walk, but your feeling of a sense of your feet movement is not, that accurate and smart. And then you can easily fall. And then you don't see the, your eyes and feet coordination, your eyes and hand coordination. These are all related to this sensory part. So it goes moved to visual attention. So visual attention, your eyes acuity, your eyes focus, eyesight, not eyesight, you're just cognitive eyes. And then you could tracking. That means it's all processing, cognitive processing. So you have inputs and processing and outputs. And then these are the what language learning, social cognition, and emotional cognition, and you have those. So let's see this. Is that really like, factual deal and fixed deal, and then you cannot touch it? Especially learning disabilities, those children are not identified before school education starts. Even we had 6 hours, retarded kids, that terms 1950s and 60s made that phrase, that report to the federal government, that much children are outside. Those terms are for the mild intellectual disabilities. At the time, it's a mild mental retardations. So outside, there are no identifiable disabilities, impairment, once you walked into school buildings. So most of those children are identified as a disability through school education. When they started the schooling, they became mental retardation. They became cognitive impairment. They became intellectual disabilities. So these days we separate them as a socioeconomic intellectual disabilities. These disabilities, mild intellectual disabilities, due to their environmental factors, their growing point stimulation was lacking. So those not much provoking and stimulation through their developmental period. So lack of environmental factors and they have a lack of language and then lack of cognition, lack of intelligence. So it's not born disability or born impairment, it's more environmental, stimuli matters. So when children started schooling, these learning disabilities, mild intellectual disabilities, and some of emotional impairment, emotional disturbance, those high instance of disabilities, many of about, I bet it's more than 90%, 80 to 90% of children did not show any symptoms before school age. So before it was all mild intellectual disabilities. Then now the schools were shocked with the children. They have a normal range, typical range of intellectual abilities, so IQs, and then they could not learn to read. They could not learn to read. They didn't know what to do with them because they are not mild intellectual disabilities. And then what is it? That's the learning disability. Nobody understood at that time why IQ 120, that smart one, because IQ 120 is a very high IQ. However, the child could not learn simple reading. IQ 100, 3-digit IQs, they could not learn to read. And school personnel could not understand. Nobody understood. And then those, functional MRI and all those, advanced technology came, and then they started just, monitoring their brain functions, brain movement while they are just having those sensory inputs. And then they found that their brain functions are a little bit different from, typical children's and all that. So educators, school education and school teachers, we don't work on their disabilities. We do not work on their impairment, because impairment and disability are different concepts, because the disability came from impairment. So these genetic and neurobiological factors, and that means if those are impairment, I'm not sure even, cognitive impairment is the right term, because impairment means it's like more like a permanency, right? It's really something cells and mechanically and physically and something, really. And then disability is a result of those, not result of a consequent effect, outcomes. Because, let's say you don't have a leg, so you cannot use your legs, and then you cannot walk, right? So you're walking disability, not really like a leg disability or just, feet disability. You cannot walk due to your leg impairment. So it's a different concept. So what I'm trying to say is, whenever I see these, some of our disability definitions and terms, and then we try to figure out all these origins, causes of disabilities, impairments, it really give wrong perspectives and insight to educators and parents. Because if we take it, these are done deal and fix the facts, and then there is no point we try to teach them, because they already have those, done deal, and that these children do not learn. It could give us, psychological comfort and reliefs, but for these children have to live with, weak reading skills, forever in their life. So I see this in the next chapter. I would say we'll talk about this one, but when we say teacher efficacy shows in this case. I'm going to talk about this one more in teacher efficacy.